So decentralization and really where I think the whole crux of the current discussion sits is when something is decentralized and it's properly decentralized, you do not have the traditional points of control. I think this really is the nub of the whole discussion here that gives governments a problem, because it's not permissioned to access the system. And then once you've accessed it, it's not permissioned within the system. So they can't stop you using it, actually signing on and signing up, and then they cannot stop you transacting with the system one way or another. And that is the polar opposite of how the traditional finance system works. With credit scores, etc., you have to apply for permission to have a bank account. So you apply to the bank, but then the bank is dealing with a whole load of other bodies and systems and things to decide whether they give you permission to access the financial system. Now, when you look at it that way, it sounds completely absurd, really, because you'd want everyone to have access to the financial system because everybody needs money to live. But that's the way the system has ended up. But if you're poor or you've made some mistakes in the past, they can actually just block you off the whole system. So what decentralized finance is trying to do is to completely rewrite the rules and say, actually, no, we will give access to everybody. But maybe where the permissioning comes in is, like you touched on in your introduction, is if we do get into lending that's unsecured, then we may start drifting back towards some of the models from traditional finance, because there are risks then associated with that type of lending. In DeFi at the moment, you've got secured lending. Fundamentally, you've got to put collateral in the system in order to take loans against it. So that loan is secured, and obviously you get liquidated, as we talk about in these flash crashes like the one we've had. Like we've had a sort of more steady crash since we last spoke last week. But there's an awful lot of liquidation going on where people have leveraged in one way or another against their position. Now in DeFi, they've probably put collateral in, they borrowed against that collateral. So maybe you've put ETH in, you've borrowed US dollar against the ETH, you've bought more ETH. So you've effectively created a leverage. And then people have a liquidation point and they get liquidated. So we see secured borrowing at the moment. So, and I guess the other side of decentralization, but to the same point, beyond the banking system, is governments use, and particularly the US government, uses its position as the reserve currency in the world to you could say benefit itself. It certainly uses that position that it has, that privilege at the moment of being the reserve currency, to try and stay in control of everything. Certainly many who aren't US citizens and don't live in the US would say those tentacles are felt far and wide. The US is controlling things that really you could say have nothing to do with the US, well outside of its jurisdiction, many different countries, and maybe outside of all of the bodies like the United Nations and any other process where countries have agreed on something. A lot of things are unilateral. So there's unilateral sanctions get written and then they get enforced by saying, well, you can't use the US dollar. Again, when you put crypto rails in, and somebody could set up a Bitcoin mine a load of Bitcoin, you don't know who they are, then they can transact on Bitcoin. Well, how can you can't permission that system. You can only permission it at the point where it turns into fiat if it's at a place where you have control. So I think that really that control mechanism that's in traditional finance and all the machine that goes around that, and you can say in the US that includes the military, it includes the whole machine that is there to protect the dollar at all cost. All of that goes up in the air with decentralization. And I think there is a realization in government that that's what it is. I think they've known that for some time. I think at the moment we're starting to see, I think they've stuck the SEC up there as the bogeyman. Somebody had to be put up there to upset everybody at the moment and start trying to say, well, this is how we think we're going to regulate it. And lo and behold, what we see is they've slipped legislation into an infrastructure bill. It's not a crypto bill. And they've tried to make it, well, we'll just KYC everything and we'll just hide it away in the corner of the bill. And of course it's blown up because the crypto industry is now so large that it's going, hang on a minute, we've read that and that's not going to work. both practically and politically. I think there's some realization going on in the US now at the size of the crypto industry. So, so if you sort of boil all that down, I think, decentralization matters if we're talking here about the next generation of currency. To go back to where you started off, Brandon, with a great introduction on sort of lending and such like. And I think this is where we just have this fundamental jam at the moment, where if this was adopted as a currency, all of that machine that's there right now to maintain, control or hegemony, or however you want to look at it, and believe me, around the world, people look at that very differently in different countries based on their experience. I currently don't know how there is a route through this for crypto, is where I sit. I think it's going to be one hell of a battle, because it sits right at the heart of the way that the US economy sort of maintains its position. And we touch back on China briefly. It's inevitable, as China's gone past the US on most measures, that it will go past on GDP. There's currently a move to try and slow that down. But this is like you're just putting the deck chairs around on the Titanic in the end. It's an impossible thing in the end. The ships, it's not sinking in the US, but there's just a change in the balance, because it won't just be China, it'll be India as well. Then there'll be other trading blocks where the populations are very high. So it just shifts the balance around, and it says politically, you need to use those bodies that are there now to start agreeing things. You can't just unilaterally write all the rules, because you don't control everything anymore. All of that realization, with crypto there as well, threatening that position, I think is creating a dynamic where there's a lot of almost fear and panic, and, we're going to lose control. Oh my God, the world's going to change. That's a disaster. So we're seeing the reaction to that at the moment, whether it's political FUD that goes everywhere, the onslaught of propaganda that's negative about everything else that affects US dollar, through to this crypto legislation. What I hope comes out at the end of this, at some point, if you go through all those phases that are in these theories of, getting angry and despair and all these things, at some point there's a realization that this is not going away. Bitcoin's not going away. Ethereum's not going away. All the DeFi that sits around that, all the innovation's not going away. So that if you don't embrace it, it's only going to move somewhere else. And then it may have some problems for a while with a lot of regulatory pressure on it, but it isn't going to go away. And as such, do you want to be part of defining that future and part of crypto? Or does the United States particularly want to do a different thing and adopt some of the models that China's deploying? And I don't say that in a negative way, because a lot of the things China's done have worked, but it's very different. It's like allowing tech to get involved in redefining payment rails and payment systems and digital experience, but it stays in traditional finance, in TradFi. It doesn't become crypto in the decentralized sense. So I think it's this big crossroads right now, and then the US has got some big decisions to make, and as has the rest of the world. And it's it's very US centric on Twitter, as it always is, but I think the rest of the world, you've got China and India both blocking crypto at the moment, which is obviously 3 billion people. You've got other countries, probably the European Union, looking at it. You've got other blocks, other maybe developing countries looking at it. Is this a way out of some of our problems, etc., etc.? I think there's it's almost like a huge point for the world as to what the US does and what everybody else does now, as to where we go. Now, control, the two things are not so separate. Actually, if you're Solana and you happen to have put all your primary servers in one country, or certainly in the allies of one country, that puts you centralized. That puts you, basically, they can turn it off. With a bit of political pressure, they can turn it off. And that's not too different to the control of the traditional banking system, in my eyes, at least. So I think it is correct that those two things are different, But I think when you come to the nub of this issue with the nation states, I think the two are very similar, that the problem the nation states have is the same one, which is we cannot control this thing and turn it off. We cannot control this thing and who's accessing it. We cannot control any transactions in there. We cannot control how it upgrades or what happens to it in the future. It's like all of this control is sitting with someone else, and it crosses all of the boundaries. You know, there's no nation state boundary on, let's say, Ethereum and Bitcoin for now to keep ourselves sane before we get into 1,000 different layer ones and all the different permutations. But neither Ethereum or Bitcoin is there as a nation state, so there's not one place you can go. You know, what would the nation state do? Create a BIP or an EIP if it wants to change something, and then push it through the process? I mean, that's, you know, the essence of an improvement ticket on both platforms. Then there's all the stakeholders that are involved in that mechanism of governance. You know, you touched on governance, and a point I would make is, you know, Bitcoin has again a different process to Ethereum, but neither is the same as some of these projects with governance tokens, which you can buy up and then vote with. Neither of them works that way. Both have the improvement process, and you know, Ethereum has a lot of stakeholders involved as well, but there's a little bit more control there in the end, with the permission from the core developers alongside, you know, a whole bunch of other stakeholders in the community. You know, there are multiple client teams because Ethereum's actually, you know, more decentralized, you can argue, than Bitcoin by having multiple implementations of everything, both on the, you know, ETH1 and ETH2 project. You know, there's multiple clients built independently from the ground up. Those people have to give are in agreement. They won't implement the change if they're not in agreement. And then you've always got the right to fork there if the whole thing splits and people don't agree that that's the right answer. So it almost enforces the fact that you have to get consensus from everybody, you know, or you're going to end up with a fork. You know, as the sort of ultimate, you know, that's the equivalent of people taking to the streets and protesting when they don't like something. In the end, is you get a fork. With both projects, you've seen, you know, people trying to fork Bitcoin, saying, I'm going to make a better version, whether it's Bitcoin Cash or whatever, saying we're going to fix this problem with block size. We're going to do, you know, wave their arms around. And we've seen the ETH Classic and the ETH fork before, and disputes in the community. And you can argue some of the other Ethereum founders who left of setting their own thing up is almost an element of dispute as well, saying, well, you're not doing what I think you should be doing, so I'm going to build a better chain. You know, so that, again, that all sits around this decentralization of governance, and, as you pointed out, decentralization of technology. You know, just on that, for the sort of layperson, I've run Ethereum nodes and transacted locally with Ethereum. And I was involved in some projects that CPU mined back in the last cycle, where you could run mining software which interacted with a local node, had automatic gas bidding walls, had all sorts of things going on. You know, both Ethereum and Bitcoin are quite similar in many aspects of that. You've got nodes that you can run yourself. You can run a full node. You can get all the history. You can interact anonymously with the network. You know, nobody knows who you are when you're sat there. Thousands and thousands of nodes distributed all over the world. You know, people have put nodes in space and here and there and trying all these, you know, almost like attention grabbing things. But there are, both networks have a lot of nodes operated by people we don't know. It's all anonymous, scattered all over the world, obviously with the power of the internet to keep everything connected. You know, both networks are the same in that regard. Both have low requirements, as you touched on. You know, so both are largely decentralized in the way they actually run the peer-to-peer network. You know, you don't know who anybody is in there, and it's very hard to shut it down. You know, we could touch on that another day, but, you know, as someone who's very technical, I would say it's not impossible to disrupt those protocols, but it would take pretty high-powered nation-state type attacks to take it out. You'd make it unusable. You wouldn't stop it. You'd just make it unusable. But for another day, I think for where we are, they're both very decentralized, Ethereum and Bitcoin. You then have really the governance is about what are we changing and how are we changing it. So Bitcoin changes very slowly. That's the whole ethos of where Bitcoin has been. It's very careful. It's very controlled. Whereas Ethereum, for me, the big difference is it's much more where I come from in a software development world. I love iteration in software, rapid iteration and innovation, so that we will want to be releasing regularly, and we will want to be changing lots of things if it's beneficial to change them. So of course you have to have robust change management around any project. I've worked on big e-commerce sites and things where you've got a lot of sales volume coming through every day, so you don't go down, horrendously expensive to go off the air, but you have to keep innovating, you have to keep changing. And for me, Ethereum feels more like that. So you've got this fundamental difference almost in the two, that Ethereum is trying to be this innovative platform that keeps on changing and evolving. As ideas change, it will change over time. Whereas Bitcoin saying, no, we've got really this model, we're going to do gentle incremental improvements, whether you say with Taproot or all the other things that have gone in over the years, but it's much more gentle. And the purpose is different. Ethereum is working more like a platform on which everybody else is then building solutions. So all of your DeFi protocol projects themselves have their own decentralized communities or not. And each one has its own characteristics, how it's governed, how the protocol's deployed, how it's managed. So they're almost like another Ethereum and Bitcoin on top of Ethereum. And there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of projects that now make up that, if not thousands now, that make up that community, that all feed into this notion of decentralization. So, on Bitcoin, you can transact in Bitcoin, and that's like the end right now. It doesn't have smart contracts. It doesn't really have a way of doing anything like a ZK rollup to scale on a layer 2 directly with full security from layer 1. You can run a side chain, which is what's happening, and there are trade-offs with that. Ethereum's become this big animal when it comes to decentralization, because you've got all the other projects as well.
Merge mining on Bitcoin is also a thing, but it's not as efficient as rollups for sure.
No, sure. I mean, there are pros and cons of all of the methods. I mean, Ethereum's almost running every method at the moment. There's so many layer 2s, as they're called, which are not layer 2s. They're side chains. They've got, whether it's the one that took off in Polygon initially, which is a proof of stake side chain, it may checkpoint back onto the main network. But each one of these has got its own factor in this decentralization, almost like discussion around Ethereum. It's not just to focus on the layer 1 and the governance of that. It's a much bigger ecosystem there, and all of the factors in there. So, so Ethereum's really, I say it's a platform on which everybody's building, and is much more complex to assess when it comes to what is centralized and what is decentralized. We're seeing the regulators understanding that to some degree, and that they're poking the bear around stable coins. They're poking the bear around decentralized protocols, focusing on lending platforms, things that replicate chunks of DeFi. They're starting to see a picture around that. Whether they're explaining it very well, I think it's a whole different discussion after reading some of the narrative this week, where it's very, very confused. But I think that's just the one or two people that have been put up there as a spokesperson at the moment. I think there is understanding underneath. But I think it's complex, and it to me is why there's a lot of similarities in the layer 1, Bitcoin to Ethereum, but there's a heck of a lot of differences when you get beyond that in the type of thing that runs in the whole ecosystem. Another point you made just around currency versus store of value, I guess, Bitcoin versus Ethereum. I'm kind of neutral on all of that, because I think the market will decide what it likes over time. Ethereum can do what Bitcoin does, plus a whole load of other stuff, is where I sit. So, whether that utility becomes more valuable over time. Let's face it, if all you're doing is holding and you're looking at the 21 million hard cap, well, if Ethereum's going to deflate on supply, well, there we go. That's the response to that. So you've now got deflating supply, all the utility, and you can just hodl it, and you're going to get an ever bigger share of the pie in the end. So if scarcity is going to drive the value, pretty simple argument. Well, you've now got, you know, more scarcity with ETH than you have with Bitcoin. It's been interesting seeing the narrative shift from store of value and digital gold back to currency recently, and payments with Bitcoin. You know, it almost feels like there's a flip-flopping around of narratives a little bit, when personally I don't really pay too much attention to all of that. So I said, I think the market's going to deal with all of that stuff. It's all almost like maxi narrative in the end. It's just throwing arguments around that this one's better than that one for some spurious reason. You know, really there's room for Bitcoin and Ethereum in crypto. There's not a need for one. You know, which one's the better investment over time? You know, that's a whole different subject for me. You know, if Bitcoin becomes a currency and becomes universally accepted, and it dismantles a lot of the political issues in the world, I'm all for that. You know, I think there could be a huge change to the dynamics in the world, you know, albeit with some risks, because change can always go completely haywire. But, you know, I'm for that. So I'm not, you know, I'm sitting with perhaps a neutral shirt color over here, not sitting in any camp. You know, perhaps I should get a Swiss shirt with a, you know, we'll stay neutral on everything. But I you know, I see a very plural world there in crypto, and I would say I see the problems that are faced by crypto as the same. It's the whole industry that faces these problems, and the more the industry works together to tackle them and works with the regulators, the better over time. If crypto splinters and all we get is people trying to write Bitcoin friendly legislation, or trying to write Ethereum friendly legislation, or someone comes along and says the future's got to be, you know, EGLD, and I'm going to tweet it all over the place, and we're going to influence to spend, you know, $300 million on trying to lobby. It all just gets stupid. What we need is sensible regulation for crypto to allow the industry to evolve right now, rather than killing it at this early stage. And then over time to evolve that regulation as things start to take shape in the market as to who's leading, who's doing things that we like, who's doing things that we don't. So, you know, probably rambled off around lots of things there, but that was just a few points back to where you were with, you know, so no idea what's going on there. So not terminal, thankfully. So yeah, so proof of work for me, I'm a proof of work miner right now on a small scale with Ethereum, you know, the way you've been for some time. And, you know, it's something I sort of grew to like and understand. But you know, those who know me and have followed me for a while, I'm also somebody who's big on sustainability and the need to clean up. You know, if we don't deal with climate change, we're rolling the dice to say, well, if the scientists, most of them that agree we have a big problem, are correct, we probably don't have a planet. So that's kind of a problem. So actually doing things that increase the problem with climate change is a bad idea right now. And that, you know, as I've been digging around in China, really sat at the heart of the problem in China, which was there was an ever growing, you know, it was a growing percentage of all the energy consumption in China was being consumed by Bitcoin mining. And it was getting to the point in some provinces where it was disruptive. And as China's brought in an ultra high voltage distribution system, and it's now able to move energy around to where it's needed to meet the ever growing demands of a developing country, Bitcoin was in the way. Now, rightly or wrongly, and it's not a statement on the politics of it particularly, that's just the way it was. And I think the big elephant in the room for POW and Bitcoin in its current form is the charts that show that the hash rate follows the price on Bitcoin, which means the energy consumption follows the price. So if those Bitcoin models are correct and we're going to see $400,000 Bitcoin, then we're going to see millions of dollars Bitcoin as the Bitcoiners predict. That's going to become an impossible amount of energy. It becomes an arms race. Countries want to get involved if that's the Bitcoin The Bitcoin, I think, says, great, we've got countries coming in, you can build your own Bitcoin mines and you can generate your own wealth. You don't have to be subservient to someone else. You're not borrowing from a World Bank or whoever it is, or sorry, in another country or whatever at that point. Okay, but if that proof of work environmental cost just becomes impossible, where are we as a planet? You know, it's just, it almost feels to me like oil all over again, that we're going to have some crazy rush. We're not, you know, it's all about dollars and not about anything sort of productive for the planet in the end. It just becomes a rush. And the other side of proof of work is difficulty. And this for me is, again, a huge thing you notice as a small scale miner. You know, our return for Ethereum per day is the same at the moment, roughly in sterling, as it was in July last year. Now, the price of Ethereum has gone from $300 to well over $3,000 in that time. So as it's gone up, lo and behold, so is the hash rate. So the good old chart is holding up again. You know, the hash rate has gone up. And it means, you know, it means that it is following that it can remain profitable right now. But over time, I see another problem with the arms race, that as a country, the Bitcoiners say, well, you can invest in your own hash power, but is it going to be any different to oil, and suddenly the oil price goes right up? If suddenly someone can turn on a pile of mining and shove the difficulty right up and make your mining completely uneconomic, and you're not going to be able to, you know, to mine anymore at a profit, you know, so you're going to generate a third or a quarter or a fifth or an eighth or a tenth of what you generated last week. Suddenly there's no guarantee of return on proof of work mining. You know, there's nothing programmed into the system that says, you know, based on how many people are staking or something like that, there's a yield curve here that means that you can predict what's going to happen. You don't know. It's completely out of your control. So countries could be effectively in an arms race against each other on mining capacity. How that benefits a poor country, I have no idea. When I look at it, that just looks like another problem.
Well, yeah,
so,
ultimately access to cheap energy and access to the hardware necessary to mine it are the two most important things.
And then I would say, in a world that's, you know, El Salvador's been a slightly strange pin-up, shall we say, for Bitcoiners at the moment. You've got a guy who's basically almost like a dictator, who's forced a KYC'd wallet out there, obviously saying you can use a different one if you want, but you won't get your $30, in a country that's reportedly well over 90% oil-based energy generation. If you look at the work China's doing on redistributing energy around the country, the counter argument to all of that is that cheaper energy can be consumed somewhere else to offset carbon. And until the world has got itself to where it needs with its climate targets, all of the work should be going into getting clean energy to where it's needed to turn off fossil fuels. And that lobby will be on the other side of the argument against Bitcoin. So I see that as a real negative against proof of work. And they will soon put in their list. And the number 2 cryptocurrency in Ethereum doesn't have this problem. So why the heck are you interested in Bitcoin? That's going to come as an argument against Bitcoin. And all these arguments will be put forward. I see some things that make me laugh from Michael Saylor. He tries to big up until he sells enterprise solutions, he just bigs up all these little points regularly and the way he presents it. But I'm, you know, and I know I admire him for going all in. You know, if there was ever a guy who's all in, he's gone, you know, all in and all in again. But I don't see this going away. And you know, and I'm not someone who is sat here anti-Bitcoin and won't hold Bitcoin, because I hold Bitcoin because it has a lot of characteristics about it that I like. I have to say, someone who's into sustainability, though, I don't like proof of work. The more I've looked at it over the past year, the more I'm happy with the direction Ethereum is going and the reasons why it's put those things out there. And I see an awful lot more of the newer cryptocurrency chains, the innovation that's taking place out there is all around versions of proof of stake. We are not really seeing people coming along with versions of proof of work in any great numbers. You know, there will be some, and there's always people who will be looking to pick up perhaps the miners when they exit from Ethereum. You have all this hardware, etc., etc. But that's, you know, I sit there with proof of work. And the other point I would make, and I made it before in a different video, proof of work's a physical thing. When the hegemony in the world is often enforced with the military, it's quite good not to have physical things sometimes, which I think many countries would certainly understand as a principle, you know, because it's quite easy to just take them away, you know, whether that's through plunder or destroying them or disrupting them or whatever. It's very hard to disrupt proof of stake nodes hidden behind, you know, anonymizing networks on the internet. Very, very hard to take those out. You have no idea where they are. So I think there are a lot of benefits to proof of stake. So, you know, I'm not anti-Bitcoin, but I'm very much in the place that I think proof of stake has a lot going for it. And I think the market's very likely to price that in over time. I think, you know, there are security benefits, perhaps slightly different topic for another day, but there are benefits to trying to acquire 51% on proof of stake. Means you're trying to buy up the supply, which pushes the price up. So, you know, it almost self-regulates as a mechanism. And there are arguments that 51% isn't even there because it's all locked up in staking after a while. So how do you buy the supply? How can you gain control? You know, very, very, very hard. And there's some mathematics, and Vitalik published some things about how it's much harder to attack the network with a 51% attack. You know, that's not to say there aren't other attacks, but 51% is very, very hard.
Typically you need 66% to enforce a double spend on a proof of stake system, not 51%. So it's technically more resilient than proof of work.